This is a video in regards to a battery going dead repeatedly on a late model Ram 2500. Like many battery drains, they tend to be intermittent these days. Before we talk about it, I'd like to talk about what were once common issues on pre-computer vehicles, such as a 55 Chevy. Alternators became a common failure point. One of my first jobs was rebuilding alternators, and I was able to see the failure points close up. It's common to see alternator rebuild shops for this reason as well. Many of the failures of these alternators were brushes and diodes. Many manufacturers had, for the most part, designed and built their own alternators. Chrysler's kind of been a company that doesn't tend to build their own alternators. Ford and GM do. These days, we see mostly Japanese alternators on Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram vehicles. Those would be Nippon Denso and Mitsubishi alternators. Now, there was a recall for the Nippon Denso alternators on the Grand Cherokees and Chargers. I think it was 2011 to 14 model year. Basically, I'm not sure what they had failing inside of them. I'm pretty sure the diodes were failing and shorting out. So not only would it not charge, but it drained the battery really quickly. Had like a 10 amp draw on some of them. So back to what I was talking about. The issues in the past with battery drains were issues like misadjusted door switches, misadjusted glove box latch strikers, keeping the glove box light on. Typically older cars, it would be powered up all the time. Eventually they switched to doing it differently. Dome lamp switch was kicked by a kid and it would kill the battery. Headlamp being left on. Maybe they didn't turn it all the way and park lights were on. Eventually these cars evolved into powering up a lot more components. Transmissions needed computers, airbags needed computers, engines, radios, and so on. One area that has not changed much is in the design and operation of the alternator. Now, the alternator and the battery. Batteries do last less time these days because of things that are drawing lots of power, such as stop-start and heat taking a toll on those batteries. Stop-start system is probably shortening it down to about 2 years on some vehicles that Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram makes, like the Pacifica. It used to be 3 or 4 years until they came out with stop-start. It does not help that many of these shops are throwing away thermal blankets that wrap the battery. Don't ever throw those blankets away. That's helping keep the heat out, and in the cold, keep it a little bit warmer. Overall, the Japanese alternators on Mopars and cars and trucks are working pretty well. Now let's talk about battery drains on modern vehicles. If you have a 30 milliamp draw on a 55 Chevy, it's probably going to be the radio because nothing else really had transistors at that point. Maybe the wiper motor, probably not. Regardless, 10 to 40 milliamps is the average draw on a battery with battery inside a modern vehicle. Mopar likes to cut costs like all car companies, and one way they do that is cutting down on copper use and oil use. As far as a wire insulation, it's most likely going to be soy-based wire insulation, which is why you see so many rodents eating harnesses these days. Copper is not cheap either, so if they can save 30 feet of 20 gauge wire or more, that powers up, let's say, the radio switch banks, instrument cluster, door modules, etc. They're going to definitely cut out 30 feet of wire to save a bunch of money, so that can translate to millions. How do they do it? Well, so the way they power up vehicles nowadays on Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram vehicles, many of the modules, not all of them, but most, you'll see that the CAN network is what they use, and it's a communication network like a telephone line between the, let's say, the cluster, the body module, the door modules, stuff like that. That's going to basically send out a signal on those two wires, and it's going to tell the computers to wake up. If you touch a door handle on a keyless go Ram truck like this one, you get the door handle switch that's sensing a human hand to change resistance on the two-wire circuit that is actually going to the radio frequency hub, which is behind the rear seats. This event should wake up the body control module and other modules, such as the instrument cluster and door modules. The modules are always on, but they draw a very small amount of current, usually below 1 milliamp, typically way below 1 milliamp. They're just sitting dormant in a hibernated state, waiting for the CAN network master module, which is BCM, to say, hey, look, it's time to wake up. The interesting thing about the stickers on batteries is they have numbers in relation to reserve capacity listed as RC, which is how long a fully charged new battery can keep enough voltage, in theory, to keep the vehicle operating. Also, it's dependent on how much amperage your loads carry, such as headlights. The next part is AH, which is amps per hour. This translates to how many amps in 1 hour the battery can put out until it reaches a discharge state. Now, on this vehicle that we're looking at, it was going dead sometimes in a few days, sometimes it took a month. And it wasn't driven that much, but it still shouldn't have gone dead within a few days. And what I noticed was when it was filling, and I need the vehicle for a couple weeks to monitor it, it seemed to be happening when it was cold. And it would be a couple hundred milliamps, drop down to 50, and then go up to 3 or 4 amps and keep doing that. When that would happen, the cluster would always come on for a few seconds, and sometimes a radio. Now, pulling fuses wasn't really working out. It's not really a great idea on modern cars, so I checked voltage drops, and the radio and other modules had voltage drops. So at that point, I knew that something had to be waking up, the bus system like we just talked about. Well, one of the things I had noticed is when I tapped on the top of the dash, which wiggle and tap testing should be done if you're trying to figure out an intermittent issue on anything that's electrical, I noticed that the radio and cluster came on and shut off just like when it was filling, and the current matched up. Well, at that point, disconnected what was below, which was the instrument cluster. Yeah, the current dropped a little bit, but it was still filling by looking at the ammeter and the radio. At that point, I tapped on some things, a headlamp switch. I barely touched it and it was filling. So at that point, I disconnected the headlight switch and the car came alive and was doing what it was doing. And that would have probably been enough, but I decided to pull out the scope and check the multiplex wire going to the BCM for the headlamp position. And as you can see here, it was jumping up, throwing voltage out when I would lightly tap on it, and that wasn't normal. So most cars, headlamp switch, you leave it on, it's going to not kill the battery. It's going to time out. BCM is going to shut the computers down, turn the headlights off. But in this case, it was throwing out a signal every 5 or 10 minutes, and it kept waking up high current things like the radio and stuff. So it was causing the battery to go dead, even though technically it shouldn't have ever happened. So who knows if the software was kind of not built very well and no one thought of this scenario. I'm sure there's a way to make sure this doesn't happen. It's just probably poor software, but regardless, a headlamp switch fixed it. So